So for the first How It's Written, I want to talk about Game of Thrones, the 1997 Hugo Award-winning novel by George R.R. Martin that became a tremendous TV series and then a ruined TV series on HBO. But I specifically want to focus on the book and how it's plotted, how it's written, how it goes together. Because before it was a great TV show, and before it was a ruined TV show, and I'm going to work that gag to death, it had to be a fantastic book. The first thing to know about Game of Thrones is that it's epic. It's very epic. It's some 300,000 words across 73 chapters and 8 point-of-view characters. This really makes it less of a novel and more of a series of interlinking novellas, each character going through their own arc and providing their own perspective, which is what allows Martin to give you the epic feeling of this story. We're seeing a big story, and we have to look at it from a lot of different perspectives to give it the sense of scale. So by length, it's Ned's story, Eddard Stark, right? But just barely. And then Catelyn comes in second. My clever little note here, there's no such thing as a happy Mother's Day in Westeros. This is a sad story for parents, I mean, in many ways. And then the book coming in third by word count is Tyrion. So you could say that those are the main and most important characters, but really it's pretty equally distributed, except for Arya's story, which is interesting because that's the one that really stuck with me. That was the one that I really liked her story. Ned's story is a tragedy that I call Ned Stark, Man of Honor. So we start off at the beginning of the book, and he's the good guy, right? He's the good father, he's the good ruler, he's honorable. And we see that in the passage where he executes the runaway from the Night's Watch. We hold to the belief that the man who passes sentence should swing the sword. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. And if you cannot bear to do that, then perhaps the man does not deserve to die. This sentiment is diametrically opposed to the way that politics works in this world. And then beat 2 of this story comes all the way at the end. Like he's trying to do the right thing all the way through for his friend Robert, who's asked him to be Hand of the King. But he's quite outmatched because he is, in a sense, too good of a man for this world. But right at the end, when King Joffrey says, "My mother bids me let Lord Eddard take the black, and Lady Sansa has begged mercy for her father." Right? And that would be awesome because we get to see this character that we really love, who's a badass, Ned Stark. He's going to go to the Night's Watch and he's going to be united with Jon, who's the other strong moral character in the work, right? And now they're going to get to bond, they're going to get to have adventures, and they're going to overcome this terrible menace that's going to destroy the kingdom, the world. It's going to be awesome. Except, no, it's not. Because then there's a third beat to that story, when Joffrey says, in the very next breath, "But they have the soft hearts of women. So long as I am your king, treason shall never go unpunished. Sir Ilyn, bring me his head." And this is one of the things that's really cool about this book, because you would expect in a typical fantasy novel that the good guy would win, balance would be restored to the kingdom, all that jazz, right? And George R.R. Martin, right out of the gate, this is not that kind of story. This is not that kind of world. So I mapped out the entire book by chapter length and point of view. And this makes it very easy to see how Martin keeps you reading, right? He's got a series of interlocking characters. Each chapter has its own little cliffhanger. So you're going to keep reading to get back to the character that you really care about. And it makes it kind of a net, because if you have enough characters spread out, and the story has to be properly constructed and everything, but if you have enough characters, one or two of them you're really going to latch onto and identify with for a whole host of reasons. So it's super useful, but technically, right, it's all third-person omniscient point of view. So there are some things that you give up, even though it's such a wonderful technique, because you can't have the unreliable narrator. But you can have contrasting points of view between different factions and different people, and it's how he creates such moral ambiguity. We can see things from all sides. There is a considerable variation in chapter length. There are some really long chapters in this book, but then there are some really short chapters. So it's interesting. I mean, I think about chaptering. Sometimes you can think about it at the sentence level, right? Where you have a paragraph, you have a long paragraph, and then you have one-line paragraph. And we'll see he does the same thing for emphasis in his prose. So, Bran's story, he wants to be a powerful force for good. And then he gets pushed out of the tower. Spoiler alert? Nah, man, everybody knows this story, right? Bran was going to be a knight himself someday, one of the king's guard. Old Nan said they were the finest swords in all the realm. He's a young boy who aspires to be a strong knight. I mean, it's a perfectly ordinary and reasonable and noble ambition in a fantasy novel. So Catelyn, I read as a kind of Cassandra figure. She sees the entire thing coming right from the beginning when Robert Baratheon rides into Winterfell. "You knew the man," she said. "The king is a stranger to you." Catelyn remembered the dire wolf dead in the snow, the broken antler lodged deep in her throat. Now, obviously, every 8th grader writing a book report, what kind of 8th grader would read this and write a book report on it for a class? Anyway, it's just any I don't know, 8th grade English student, anybody who's had 8th grade English, could recognize that this is pretty obvious symbolism here. One might even say ham-handed because, the stag is the symbol of House Baratheon and the dire wolf is the sigil of House Stark. But I don't mind it. It's keeping with the thematic thing, and it's such a grisly image. So Arya has a contrary expectation about what she wants to be as a person, as opposed to everybody else around her. It's not all that unusual to have a female character in a fantasy novel who doesn't really want to be a princess, right? Wants to be an adventurer. So she wants to be a warrior, basically. And that story we have in several beats. And she says right at the beginning, "I don't want to be a lady." And as wonderful and as cute as the lessons with the dancing master are, they come with a terrible price. And we see that in the scene where he gets killed and she has to flee and she goes on the streets. And she wanted this life of adventure and she gets it, right? And it's not fun. It's not romantic because it's not that kind of book. And that's driven home when she kills a guy. Needle went through his leather jerkin and the white flesh of his belly and came out between his shoulder blades. When she took it out, he died. I really like that sentence, right? And that's that sort of longer passage, boom, short sentence to deliver the punch, longer chapter, shorter chapter. It's a 1-2 thing that it always works. What's interesting about that for me too is it's a level of detail. That's actually how somebody dies if they've been impaled or run through with a sword. If you're ever so injured, you should leave whatever is in you because that stops the bleeding and holds everything together so the emergency room personnel can treat you better. But if you pull it out, then all of a sudden you have blood loss, there's lots of trauma, infection. Like that's quite a good detail rather than just, she stabbed him and he died, right? That's not the same thing. When she pulled it out, I don't know, for that detail really works for me because I can almost start to feel how that would feel like in it. If it wouldn't feel good, right? So Sansa, by contrast, has a more normal story arc. She wants to marry a handsome prince and become a queen, right? She's all about Prince Joffrey. He's so dreamy, except it doesn't turn out like she thinks, right? That's kind of a classic reversal. Your character wants something, and when they get it, it turns out to be not at all what they thought or not really what they wanted. And he does this nice thing in one sentence, right? He just drives it all home. The wreck, the loss, all of it. She drew the curtains around her bed, slept, woke weeping, and slept again. Man, that just sucks. So Tyrion is trying to redeem himself, to live up to his father's expectations, to get his father's approval. And he fails. That was when he knew. You have given him up for lost, he thought. You bloody bastard, you think Jaime's good as dead, so I'm all you have left. Tyrion wanted to slap him in the face, to spit in his face, to draw his dagger and cut the heart out of him, and see if it was made of old hard gold, the way the small folks said. And that just, for all the comedy and the brilliance and the wit and the charisma that Tyrion has, right? This is just this burning, like you didn't really get that in the show. This is this burning. Oh, it's just, you really, his internal story is really rough. And then Jon Snow's arc is him becoming his own man, him finding his way and his place in the world, finding his confidence, all of that. And this is driven home when he sort of makes a choice to lean into the Night's Watch, when Jorah Mormont says, "God save us, boy, you're not blind and you're not stupid. When dead men come hunting in the night, do you think it matters who sits the Iron Throne?" This is that frame, that monster in the house story, right? So while everyone is squabbling over the kingdoms, this huge threat is coming from the north, coming through the wall to destroy everything. And that adds an element of horror to this thriller, right? You're just like, you can't believe how petty and stupid these people are because they don't see what Jon sees, what the Night's Watch sees, the real threat coming from the north. And then Daenerys goes from being powerless, basically being chattel in her brother's thrall, right, to being the mother of dragons. Which is a very cool story. And I want to emphasize the other thing that Martin does with these stories is he uses magic so sparingly and so well. Because every time you encounter magic in the book, it's very rare, and it's always magical in that it changes everything. Major plot points hinge on magic in this book, and it becomes quite terrifying, which I think is a great way to think about or conceptualize magic for fiction, because if it existed, you don't want somebody like turning on the lights with it or scrambling eggs. Like, it's got to be a big deal. And in this book, every single time, in these books, all of them, every single time magic is involved, it's a big deal. So I've put everything that I've set up to this point into a PDF. I made a map of the story a while back. It has the major plot points. It has them mapped out. It has them showed where they are in the timeline. And if you want it, you can use the link in the description to get it. So let's take a look at some of his writing, right? And I just want to look at the prologue because this is really interesting. And it's also I think it's overlooked in fantasy or science fiction when you're setting up a world, how well done the first chapter has to be, and all the work of how you reveal information and where you reveal it. There's a great deal of skill because it can degenerate into exposition. How do you keep it moving forward? How do you set the correct tone? All of that happens in this prologue, and it happens masterfully. So we start in media res, right? The middle of things, where epic stories always seem to start. This story, these families have been going on for generations, and we are playing catch up. And we're playing catch up in the prologue, right? We don't even know who these characters are. Initially, we don't even know what they look like. We don't know what they're looking for. And we don't know whether and how magical the world is. We also have certain genre expectations. And I remember coming to this book, I read a lot of fantasy when I was younger. I mean, a lot. Like, I cleaned out the bookstore and I closed out the library in fantasy and science fiction. So I haven't really gone back to fantasy all that much. And somebody said that I had to read this book. I think it was about 2002. That I really had to read it. It was really great. They explained to me it was like, I don't know, The Sopranos meets Lord of the Rings. And initially my response was, well, they had said it was a fantasy book. And initially my response was, man, I need to read another fantasy book. Like, I need a hole in my head. And I got to tell you, I read it, I picked it up. It was great. I don't think that this book will, these books will become the next Shakespeare. They will not go down in history that way. I may be wrong about that. But man, they are just really great, entertaining thrillers set in a fantasy world with a level of political intrigue that we've never really seen in fantasy before. So the question is, if you're writing this book, right, people come to it with these expectations of genre. And from the very beginning, how does Martin handle these expectations so that the reader is sucked in and the reader knows where they are, what to expect, and wants more? This is another thing, the skill of which can't be overstated. First line, "We should start back," Garrett urged as the woods began to grow dark around them. "The wildlings are dead." "Do the dead frighten you?" Sir Waymar Royce asked with just a hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man, past 50, and he had seen the lordlings come and go. Dead is dead, he said. We have no business with the dead. Are they dead? Royce asked softly. What proof have we? So now we have conflict between the two characters that we're struggling to figure out who they are, but we immediately have conflict between these characters. And that is very useful for creating horror, because while they are fighting, there's something else here that we're going to run into, right? The classic film example of this in my mind is the first Alien. As the alien is on the ship and they're getting in deeper, deeper trouble, everybody on the ship is fighting with each other and sort of grating against the corporation who's put them out there. Okay, so what proof have we? Will saw them, Garrett said. He says, or if he says they're dead, that's proof enough for me. Now we introduce a third character. Will had known they would drag him into the quarrel sooner or later. He wished it had been later rather than sooner. My mother told me that dead men sing no songs, he put in. My wet nurse said the same thing, Will, Royce replied. Never believe anything you hear at a woman's tit. There are things to be learned even from the dead. His voice echoed too loud in the twilit forest. Now that's interesting, the voice echoed too loud. It sort of hints that false bravado, maybe he shouldn't be saying this. Take that sentence away from that paragraph, and then it loses a little ominous foreshadowing, I think. We have a long ride before us, Garrett pointed out. 8 days, maybe 9, and night is falling. Sir Weimar Royce glanced at the sky with disinterest. It does that every day about this time. Are you unmanned by the dark, Garrett? So now we are establishing that Will is the point of view character for this chapter, and has been all along if you really go back and read it closely. Will could see the tightness around Garrett's mouth, the barely suppressed anger in his eyes under the thick black hood of his cloak. Garrett had spent 40 years in the Night's Watch, man and boy, and he was not accustomed to being made light of. Yet it was more than that. Under the wounded pride, Will could sense something else in the older man. You could taste it, a nervous tension that came perilously close to fear. That's another interesting turn of phrase right there. You could say, that sentence, the last sentence could be, you could taste the fear. But it seems to lose something for me if you do that. Now, you have to think about maybe why that works that way. You could taste it, a nervous tension that came perilously close to fear. People don't like to admit, especially men, sometimes don't like to admit they're afraid. And that is saying fear. Because a nervous tension that comes perilously close to fear, nervous tension is fear. There's no other way about it. But taking this roundabout way of saying it gives it a different effect. Will shared his unease. Again, another synonym for the word fear. You don't want to directly use the word fear if you're really afraid. They're not admitting to themselves that they're afraid. Maybe they're pushing on in spite of fear. That's the effect that this gives us. He had been 4 years on the wall. The first time he had been sent beyond, all the old stories had come rushing back, and his bowels had turned to water. He had laughed about it afterwards. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now. Hey, that's the book's typo, not mine. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now, and the endless, dark wilderness that the Southron called the haunted forest had no more terrors for him. Yeah, see, he's still downplaying the fear. He's saying he's not afraid, yet he has unease. That's interesting, because we're getting two different messages here, and it creates tension as we read it. The other interesting thing to note here is we've got the word Southron instead of Southern. We're using a non-standard, vernacular. And that's a genre expectation of fantasy. How do you convey to someone in words that they're not in a world that is the world they're used to? And you do it with word choice a lot of times. And there we go. Until tonight, something was different tonight. There was an edge to this darkness that made his hackles rise. Again, that's just straight fear. Fear makes your hackles rise. 9 days they had been riding north and northwest, then north again, farther and farther from the wall, hard on the track of a band of wilding raiders. And now we do use the repetition in that sentence so nicely to emphasize, to give the experience in that sentence of something taking longer than it should or taking a long time. Each day had been worse than the day that had come before it, and today was worst of all. A cold wind was blowing out of the north, and it made the trees rustle like living things. All day Will had felt as though something were watching him, something cold and implacable that loved him not. Garrett had felt it too. Will wanted nothing so much as to ride hell-bent for the safety of the wall, but that was not a feeling to share with your commander, especially not a commander like this one. Sir Wymar Royce, now we're getting introduced to this guy, was the youngest son of an ancient house with too many heirs. He was a handsome youth of 18, gray-eyed and graceful and slender as a knife. Mounted on his huge black destrier. Again, that choice of an unfamiliar word, that's an older usage. It means war horse, to suggest that we're in a fantasy world. It's not exactly a fantasy world. Every world in a book is a fantasy world. I don't mean that to say fantasy world is to be derogatory in any way. Every book is a fantasy of a kind, but this is suggesting that this story is taking place in a time that's not ours. The knight towered above Will and Garrett on their smaller garrons. Those are ponies, basically. He wore black boots, leather boots, woolen pants, black moleskin gloves, and a fine supple coat of gleaming black ringmail over layers of black wool and boiled leather. Sir Waymar had been a sworn brother of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say he had not prepared for his vocation, at least insofar as his wardrobe was concerned. His cloak was his crowning glory, sable, thick, and black, and soft as sin. "Bet he killed them all himself, he did," Garrett told the barracks over wine. "Twisted their little heads off, our mighty warrior." They had all shared the laugh. Now here's an interesting thing. So the prologue has to set up the rest of the book. And it sets up your expectations of the rest of the book, and it needs to pull you in. It needs to be very thrilling, which, as we're seeing, or as we're about to see, this is. But we have a leader who is out of touch with what the people on the ground, the people who really know, are going through. And that's interesting because the people who are most competent in this situation aren't having enough input on the situation, right? They're being overruled by someone who is naive to the dangers that they face and perhaps is not seasoned enough to deal with the real world. And that's a theme that you're going to see played out through the rest of the books. "It's hard to take orders from a man you laughed at in your cups," Will reflected, as he sat shivering atop his garron. Garrett must have felt the same. "Mormont said as we should track them, and we did," Garrett said. "They're dead. They shan't trouble us no more. There's hard riding before us. I don't like this weather. If it snows, it could be a fortnight getting back, and snow's the best we can hope for. Ever seen an ice storm, my lord?" See, there we go. Here's the reality of the situation they're in. The lordling seemed not to hear him. He studied that deepening twilight in that half-bored, half-distracted way he had. Will had ridden with the knight long enough to understand that it was best not to interrupt him when he looked like that. "Tell me again what you saw, Will. All the details. Leave nothing out." Will had been a hunter before he joined the Night's Watch. Well, a poacher, in truth. Mallister free riders had caught him red-handed in the Mallister's own woods, skinning one of the Mallister's own bucks, and it had been a choice of putting on the black or losing a hand. No one could move through the woods as silent as Will, and it had not taken the Black brothers long to discover his talent. "The camp is 2 miles farther on over that ridge, hard beside a stream," Will said. "I got as close as I dared. There's 8 of them, man and woman both. No children I could see. They put a lean-to against the rock. The snow's pretty well covered it now, but I could still make it out. No fire burning, but the fire pit was still plain as day. No one moving. I watched a long time. No living man ever lay so still." "Did you see any blood?" "Well, no," Will admitted. "Did you see any weapons?" Some swords, a few bows. One man had an axe, heavy-looking, double-bladed, a cruel piece of iron. It was on the ground beside him, right by his hand. Did you make note of the positions of the bodies? Will shrugged. Most of them are on the ground, fallen-like. Or sleeping, Royce suggested. Fallen, Will insisted. There's one woman up in Ironwood, half hid in the branches of Far Eyes. He smiled thinly. I took care she never saw me. When I got closer, I saw she wasn't moving neither. Despite himself, he shivered. You have a chill? Royce asked. Some, Will muttered. The wind, milord. The young knight turned back to his grizzled man-at-arms. Frost-fallen leaves whispered past them, and Royce's destrier moved restlessly. What do you think might have killed these men, Garrett? Sir Weimar asked casually. He adjusted the drape of his long sable cloak. It was the cold, Garrett said with iron certainty. I saw men freeze last winter, and the one before, when I was half a boy. Everyone talks about snows 40 feet deep and how the ice wind comes howling out of the north, but the real enemy is the cold. It steals up on you quieter than will, and at first you shiver and your teeth chatter and you stamp your feet and dream of mulled wine and nice hot fires. It burns, it does. Nothing burns like the cold, but only for a while. Then it gets inside you and starts to fill you up, and after a while you don't have the strength to fight it. It's just easier to sit down or go to sleep. They say you don't feel any pain towards the end. First you go weak and drowsy, and everything starts to fade, and then it's like sinking into a sea of warm milk. Peaceful-like. Such eloquence, Garrett, Sir Weimar observed. I never suspected you had it in you. I've had the cold in me too, lordling. Garrett pulled back his hood, giving Sir Weimar a good look at the stumps where his ears had been. 2 ears, 3 toes, and the little finger off my left hand. I got off light. We found my brother frozen at his watch with a smile on his face. Sir Weimar shrugged. You ought to dress more warmly, Garrett. This is a real prick thing to say, right? So we're really far off into thinking that this officer, right, is just totally incompetent, totally stupid, just doesn't know what's going on. Garrett glared at the lordling. The scars around his earholes flushed red with anger where Master Aemon had cut the ears away. We'll see how warm you can dress when the winter comes. He pulled up his hood and hunched over his Garren, silent and sullen. If Garrett said it was the cold, Will began. Have you drawn any watches this past week, Will? Yes, my lord. There was never a week when he did not draw a dozen bloody watches. What was the man driving at? And how did you find the wall? Weeping, Will said, frowning. He saw it clear enough now that the lordling had pointed it out. They couldn't have froze. Not if the wall was weeping. It wasn't cold enough. Now we have a reversal. Turns out the Lord is not quite so stupid and out of touch as we think. Royce nodded. Bright lad. We've had a few light frosts this past week, and a quick flurry of snow now and then, but surely no cold fierce enough to kill 8 grown men clad in fur and leather. Let me remind you, with shelter near at hand and the means of making fire. The knight's smile was cocksure. Will lead us there. I would see these dead men for myself. And then there was nothing to be done for it. The order had been given, and honor bound them to obey. Will went in front, his shaggy little Garren picking the way carefully through the undergrowth. A light snow had fallen the night before, and there were stones and roots and hidden sinks lying just under its crust, waiting for the careless and the unwary. Sir Weimar Royce came next, his great black destrier snorting impatiently. The warhorse was the wrong mount for ranging, but try and tell that to the lordling. Garrett brought up the rear. The old man-at-arms muttered to himself as he rode. So we still have the tension between, the guys who know and the guy who's in the fancy clothes. Twilight deepened. The cloudless sky turned a deep purple, the color of an old bruise, then faded to black. The stars began to come out. A half-moon rose. Will was grateful for the light. We can make a better pace than this, surely, Royce said when the moon was full risen. Not with this horse, Will said. Fear had made him insolent. Perhaps my lord would care to take the lead. Sir Weimar Royce did not deign to reply. Somewhere off in the wood, a wolf howled. Will pulled his Garen over beneath an ancient gnarled ironwood and dismounted. "Why are you stopping?" Sir Waymar asked. "Best to go the rest of the way on foot, my lord. It's just over that ridge." Royce paused a moment, staring off into the distance, his face reflective. A cold wind whispered through the trees. His great sable cloak stirred behind him like something half alive. So I want to talk about that last sentence too, because a novel is very visual. I mean, what a novel gets you, and why it was novel or new to begin with, is you got a great deal of psychological depth, or you could have psychological depth into characters, but it's also a very powerfully visual thing, even though it's only done in words. Usually we think of this now as movies, or television shows. But that's a clear image. Like, you can see that as a keyframe in a storyboard, right? You could see that drawn as sable cloak stirring behind him. "There's something wrong here," Garrett muttered. The young knight gave him a disdainful smile. "Is there?" "Can't you feel it?" Garrett asked. "Listen to the darkness." Will could feel it. 4 years in the Night's Watch, and he had never been so afraid. Bang! There it is. That's the first time a character owns up to being afraid in this scenario. It's been hinted at the whole chapter. Fear has been right with him, and now it turns. What was it? Wind, trees rustling, a wolf. Which sound is it that unmans you so, Garrett? When Garrett did not answer, Royce slid gracefully from his saddle. He tied the destroyer securely to a low-hanging limb, well away from the other horses, and drew his longsword from its sheath. Jewels glittered in its hilt, and the moonlight ran down the shining steel. It was a splendid weapon, castle-forged and new-made from the look of it. Will doubted that it had ever been swung in anger. "Trees press close here," Will warned. "That sword will tangle you up, my lord. Better a knife." "If I need instruction, I will ask for it," the young lord said. This guy is so dead, right? Like, just on that line, you're like, this guy is dead. "Garrett, stay here. Guard the horses." Garrett dismounted. "We need a fire. I'll see to it." "How big a fool are you, old man? If there are enemies in this wood, a fire is the last thing we want." "There's some enemies a fire will keep away," Garrett said. "Bears and dire wolves and other things." Sir Waymar's mouth became a hard line. "No fire." Now this is interesting. So we've got 3 characters here, and what that allows Martin to do is he can put one character kind of in our position. He's not on either side of the conflict, right? We don't have to choose Garrett's side or Sir Waymar's side. Now, I suppose, well, I'm certain that someone could get the same effect out of only having these 2 characters fighting, but I think it would be much more difficult to convey the whole truth of the scene only if you had these 2 characters, or from say Garrett or Sir Waymar's perspective. I mean, you could have this story could be told from Garrett's perspective, complaining about the whole thing, and he makes some obvious bitching, moaning, soldiers complaining that we as a reader could see would maybe not be so good. But because we have a non-antagonist character also in Will that Sir Waymar can explain his reasoning to without lessening the conflict. He does the little thing where he educates him about the weeping wall and uses deduction. That gives us it's another way to do it, and it's interesting because I think it makes it a little bit easier for the writer, but it gives us the reader's perspective into the fantasy world. And I've written about this in an essay called The Han Solo Theory, which is one of the reasons I think that first Star Wars movie works so well, because it's a fantastic story, and you need to have a character that allows us to enter the fantastic story. And Han Solo is, he's the guy who says, "Well, I've been all kinds of places, but I don't believe in any mystical force controlling my destiny." Now, as much as you want to believe in the force, that Bridger character definitely helps. Okay. Garrett's hood shadowed his face, but Will could see the hard glitter in his eyes as he stared at the knight. For a moment he was afraid the older man would go for his sword. It was a short, ugly thing, its grip discolored by sweat, its edge nicked from hard use. But Will would not have given an iron bob for the lordling's life if Garrett had pulled it from his scabbard. This is another interesting conflict, and it goes to the heart of the book. There's a lot of terrible things that happen, or that are going to happen in this story and subsequent books. And leaders are making these choices, and you begin to wonder, why do people put up with it? Why doesn't Garrett pull the sword from the scabbard and kill him? Well, he'd be an exile from society. There's just lots of trouble, right, that would come from that. And then there's also the unknown. Does Garrett really know that they're going into trouble? Does he have 100% certainty? Finally, Garrett looked down. No fire, he muttered, low under his breath. Royce took it for acquiescence and turned away. Lead on, he said to Will. That's another interesting point there. The conflict isn't over between these two. It's just been postponed. Royce took it for acquiescence. Will threaded their way through a thicket and then started up the slope to the low ridge where he had found his vantage point under a sentinel tree. And again, this is that use of words that we would not ordinarily use. What's a sentinel tree? I've never heard that term before. However, it makes perfect sense in the context of the story, and nobody really, you know what it means. You're not confused. Under the thin crust of snow, the ground was damp and muddy, slick footing with rocks and hidden roots to trip you up. Will made no sound as he climbed. Behind him he heard the soft metallic slither of the lordling's ringmail, the rustle of leaves, and muttered curses as reaching branches grabbed at his longsword and tugged on his splendid sable cloak. Right, so we've got the contrast between the guy who's good in the woods and the guy who's not. I think that little description of the soft metallic slither of the lordling's ringmail. I mean, you could have a little chink of ringmail, and that's kind of lazy. I mean, it doesn't give you the same beauty and precision that the soft metallic slither. Now I've got ring moving over ring like lizard skins, like reptile scales, right? And that's wow. I mean, that's a great description. There's no other way to say it. The Great Sentinel was right there at the top of the ridge where Will had known it would be, its lowest branches a bare foot off the ground. Will slid in underneath, flat on his belly in the snow and the mud, and looked down on the empty clearing below. His heart stopped in his chest. For a moment he dared not breathe. Moonlight shone down on the clearing and the ashes of the fire pit. A snow-covered lean-to, the great rock, the little half-frozen stream. Everything was just as it had been a few hours ago. They were gone. All the bodies were gone. Now, what's great about this, too, is this is a really good paragraphing, right? Because we have this longer paragraph, setting up the description. We have the list of things, the little half-frozen stream, the great rock, the lean-to, all that stuff. And then this short paragraph, short sentence, pow, they were gone. All the bodies were gone. Gods, he heard behind him. A sword slashed at a branch as Sir Waymar Royce gained the ridge. He stood there beside the sentinel, long sword in hand, his cloak billowing behind him as the wind came up, outlined nobly against the stars for all to see. I mean, that's hilarious to me, the noble outline revealing himself to anyone who's there. Get down, Will whispered urgently. Something's wrong. Royce did not move, because of course this guy doesn't move. He looked down at the empty clearing and laughed. Your dead men seem to have moved camp, Will. Will's voice abandoned him. He groped for words that did not come. It was not possible. His eyes swept back and forth over the abandoned campsite, stopped on the axe. A huge double-bladed battle axe, still lying where he had seen it last, untouched. A valuable weapon. See, now Will uses deduction to get to a place that Sir Waymar can't, because he doesn't have the experience. For Sir Waymar, the valuable weapon, he doesn't understand what it's just an axe, right? He could have, probably has his family probably owns thousands of axes. If he wants an axe, he just gets one. But out here, an axe is a valuable weapon. On your feet, Will, Sir Waymar commanded. There's no one here. I won't have you hiding under a bush. Reluctantly, Will obeyed. Sir Waymar looked him over with open disapproval. I'm not going back to Castle Black a failure on my first ranging. We will find these men. He glanced around. Up the tree. Be quick about it. Look for a fire. Will turned away wordless. There was no use to argue. The wind was moving. It cut right through him. He went to the tree, a vaulting gray-green sentinel, and began to climb. Soon, his hands were sticky with sap. Okay, boom. Now we got Sentinel is a very tall, stringy pine tree, right? You can see it in your head. And he was lost among the needles. Fear filled his gut like a meal he could not digest. He whispered a prayer to the nameless gods of the wood and slipped his dirk free of its sheath. He put it between his teeth to keep both his hands free for climbing. The taste of cold iron in his mouth gave him comfort. Down below, the lordling called out suddenly, "Who goes there?" Will heard uncertainty in the challenge. He stopped climbing. He listened. He watched. The woods gave answer, the rustle of leaves, the icy rush of the stream, a distant hoot of a snow owl. The others made no sound. So there it is again. Pow! This description, and then this short, choppy sentence that jars in. Will saw movement from the corner of his eye, pale shapes gliding through the wood. He turned his head, glimpsed a white shadow in the darkness. Then it was gone. Branches stirred gently in the wind, scratching at one another with wooden fingers. Will opened his mouth to call down a warning, and the words seemed to freeze in his throat. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it had only been a bird, a reflection on the snow, some trick of the moonlight. What had he seen, after all? Now, this is really nice. I've thought about this as a beat in horror. The first time you see something that's unbelievable, maybe you shouldn't believe it if the story is realistic. You know, if I saw a werewolf, if I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning and I saw a werewolf run by outside my window, I would not immediately leap into action. And if I called the police to tell them it was a werewolf, they would think I was crazy. And maybe I might even be crazy. I would doubt my own sensation because I'd never seen it before. And this makes this a level of realism, right? In a regular fantasy novel, it might be, they might already know what this is. But it's just so well done. So well managed, those genre tensions. "Will, where are you?" Sir Waymar called up. "Can you see anything?" He was turning in a slow circle, suddenly wary, his sword in hand. He must have felt them as Will felt them. There was nothing to see. "Answer me. Why is it so cold?" Okay, finally, Sir Waymar has joined the party, and it's a dismal soiree. It was cold, shivering. Will clung more tightly to his perch, his face pressed hard against the trunk of the sentinel. He could feel the sweet, sticky sap on his cheek. A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Now here, we have the point of view character that sort of anchors us in seeing this happening from above. Shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Tall it was, and gaunt and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new-fallen snow, there black as shadow, everywhere dappled with the deep gray-green of the trees. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. I mean, it's camouflage, right? It sounds like really, really good camouflage. Will heard the breath go out of Sir Waymar Royce in a long hiss. "Come no farther," the lordling warned. His voice cracked like a boy's. "Come no farther." He threw the long sable cloak back over his shoulders to free his arms for battle and took his sword in both hands. The wind had stopped. It was very cold. See, again, short sentence, short sentence. The other slid forward on silent feet. In its hand, not his hand, not her hand, its hand. In its hand was a longsword like none that Will had ever seen. No human metal had gone into the forging of that blade. It was alive with moonlight, translucent, a shard of crystal so thin it seemed almost to vanish when seen edge on. There was a faint blue shimmer to the thing, a ghost light that played around its edges, and somehow Will knew it was sharper than any razor. Sir Waymar met him bravely. "Dance with me, then." He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps from the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought, he was a boy no longer. but a man of the Night's Watch. So the only thing that happens here in this sword fight, before we go into it, is it's just a sword fight. Sir Waymar doesn't have his sword caught up in a tree or anything after getting the warning from Will that he should use a knife. Now there's a really good reason for that, as we're going to see. The other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper and bluer than any human eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. They emerged silently from the shadows, twins to the first. 3 of them, 4, 5. Sir Waymar may have felt the cold that came with them, but he never saw them, never heard them. Will had to call out. It was his duty and his death if he did. He shivered and hugged the tree and kept the silence. So now we've got he's staying quiet to save his life. The pale sword came shivering through the air. 1 sentence in that paragraph. Sir Waymar met it with steel. When the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound at the edge of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Royce checked a second blow, and a third, then fell back a step. Another flurry of blows, and he fell back again. Behind him, to left, to right, all around him, the watchers stood patient. Yeah, man, that patient is terrifying there, right? Faceless, silent, the shifting patterns of their delicate armor making them all but invisible in the wood. Yet they made no move to interfere. I mean, that's scarier than if they all jumped him. Again and again the swords met, until Will wanted to cover his ears against the strange, anguished keening of their clash. Sir Waymar was panting from the effort now, his breath steaming in the moonlight. His blade was white with frost. The others danced with pale blue light. Then Royce's parry came a beat too late. The pale sword bit through the ringmail beneath his arm. The young lord cried out in pain. Blood welled between the rings. It steamed in the cold, and the droplets seemed red as fire where they touched the snow. Sir Waymar's fingers brushed his side. His moleskin glove came away soaked with red. The other said something in a language that Will did not know. His voice was like the cracking of ice on a winter lake, and the words were mocking. So that's another just insanely good bit of description. Even if you've never heard the cracking of ice on a winter lake, and I have, and it's really quite spooky, you can imagine what voice that would speak with. And then also to imagine further that it's mocking. I mean, that's just you don't know what it is necessarily, but you know what it is, and it's horrifying. But the reason that works is it's a very specific sound. If you'd used any generalization in that particular sound, or if you just said his voice was cold and mocking, you just lose that effect. Sir Waymar Royce found his fury. "For Robert," he shouted, and he came up snarling, lifting the frost-covered longsword with both hands and swinging it around in a flat sidearm slash with all his weight behind it. The other's parry was almost lazy. When the blades touched, the steel shattered. Again, long paragraph, short paragraph, pow. And the reason that he's not using a knife in this situation, and the reason why that thing was let go, is we have the 2 blades, we have this clash, and the clear symbolism that the steel is no match for it. A scream echoed through the forest night, and the longsword shivered into 100 brittle pieces, the shards scattering like a rain of needles. Royce went to his knees, shrieking, and covered his eyes. Blood welled between his fingers. The watchers moved forward together as if some signal had been given. Swords rose and fell, all in deathly silence. It was cold butchery. The pale blade sliced through ringmail as if it were silk. Will closed his eyes. Far beneath them, he heard their voices and laughter, sharp as icicles. When he found the courage to look again, a long time had passed, and the ridge below was empty. Oh, well, he's gotten away with it. His cowardice in not calling out has saved his own life. He stayed in the tree, scarce daring to breathe, while the moon crept slowly across the black sky. Finally, his muscles cramping and his fingers numb with cold, he climbed down. Royce's body laid face down in the snow, one arm outflung. The thick sable coat had been slashed in a dozen places. Lying dead like that, you saw how young he was. A boy. He found what was left of the sword a few feet away, the end splintered and twisted like a tree struck by lightning. Will knelt, looked around warily, and snatched it up. The broken sword would be his proof. Garrod would know what to make of it, and if not him, surely that old bear Mormont or Maester Aemon. Would Garrod still be waiting with the horse? He had to hurry. Will rose. Sir Waymar Royce stood over him. His fine clothes were a tatter, his face a ruin. A shard from his sword transfixed the blind white pupil of his left eye. The right eye was open. The pupil burned blue. It saw. The broken sword fell from nerveless fingers. Will closed his eyes to pray. Long, elegant hands brushed his cheek, then tightened around his throat. They were gloved in the finest moleskin and sticky with blood, yet the touch was icy cold. I hope that was useful, entertaining, interesting. It took me quite a long while to do the analysis of this book and break down all the chapters like that, but I think it is pretty revealing. I'd like to say as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert on George R. R. Martin or any book. I'm reading these things as a craftsperson trying to figure out how they're made so I can make things better. It's not even a really critical reading. It's more exploratory. And hopefully you found some things that you can take away that are useful to you. If you've enjoyed this, please hit the subscribe button. Please leave a comment. Please pass it on to somebody. You know, all those social media begs that I have to put at the end of one of these videos. But most importantly, if there is a work that you'd like me to do this with, please leave it in the comments. And also, there's a link in the description that you can get that fancy graphic that I built out for this book. So, thanks for watching.